Hello and welcome to Big Speak. I'm your host, Brigadier Rakesh Bhatia. In today's episode, we will reassess the war and find out what did China achieve? Did it manage to change the geopolitical situation in the region? What was the effect of the Vietnamese war on the USSR, the USA, Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, and Laos? The questions that we will answer in this episode are: what were the factors which Beijing took into consideration before deciding to wage a punitive action against Vietnam? Also, highlight the personality traits of Deng Xiaoping which were on display during the decision making. The other question we will answer is: discuss the achievements and failures of China in the following aspects: strategic perspective, achievement of war objectives, successes and failures of operations and tactics. It is generally said that the Sino-Vietnam War was a tactics in China's grand strategy of signaling the USSR, the USA, Cambodia, ASEAN countries, briefly discuss the strategic goals of China with respect to each, and did China manage to achieve those? How did the geopolitical environment, specifically in Southeast Asia, change post Vietnam War? Did China achieve its geopolitical objective? While answering the second part of this question, you would need inputs from the entire episode. I will also advise the BSSC aspirants to go through the entire episode, because we do mention about few answering technique at different places as it appears in the discourse. Let's talk about model of Beijing's decision making process. I have divided it to external factors, psychology, personality factors of Dang, and also the internal factors. This is one way of firstly remembering the points. Secondly, if you put it across in this form, the examiner finds it very easy and he tends to give you liberal marks. Coming back to this slide, the external factors included China's global strategy. This we have discussed in the previous episodes, specifically in the geopolitical situation before the war, as well as why China invaded Vietnam. Vietnam's Indochina strategy was also discussed in these episodes. There was a split in China and Soviet Union's post-Lenin, wherein Mao wanted to be the leader of world communism. Similar aspirations existed in Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So, what was the conflict, and how did the Sino-Soviet conflict help Vietnam to forge stronger relations with Soviet Union? Vietnam invaded Cambodia, who was a close ally of China. This was a immediate trigger for China to launch a attack against Vietnam to ease pressure on Cambodia. This has also been covered in the previous episodes. Of course, territorial and border conflicts were continuing from 1978 onwards, and there were policy decisions by Vietnams which were against the economic interest of ethnic Chinese who were living in Vietnam. US played a big role in the whole war. This also has been covered in the previous episode. I'll request you to go through these. China also wanted an alteration in the world public opinion about China. That is why he decided to go in for this war and quickly withdraw before anybody else could intervene into the war. Deng's personality has been covered in detail in one of our previous episodes. We'll request you to please go through. As far as this question is concerned, you may talk about the pragmatic, resourceful, and confident Deng who was daring and was able to take risk. He ignored established beliefs and tradition and went out of his way to ensure the economic well being of China following the Vietnam War. How did it happen has been covered earlier also, and in one of the episodes in future, we will exclusively handle this. Internal situation in China was not so encouraging after Mao expired in 1976. There were conflicting interests and leaders who were opposed to each other and were causing more damage to China. That is the time Deng emerged and he wanted to assert himself. One of the ways was to show PLA its place. Deng was aware that PLA is not very capable of fighting a war. Deng wanted to continue with his modernization drive. For that, he wanted to take support of USA to portray China in the camp of USA against Soviet Union. Having seen the decision making, now let's reassess the war. It is in communist culture to carry out self criticism after an action. During this self criticism session, all aspects of military operation in Vietnam were evaluated under the following head: intelligence, command and control, operations and tactics, logistics, and a lot of emphasis was given to political work and aid the front work. Deng was very clear that the war was a tactics in China's strategy and he wanted a protracted war of attrition. Though PLA withdrew on 5th of March 1979, but the war continued much beyond this and it affected the Sino-Vietnam relation for at least a decade to follow. All were of the opinion that PLA was at that time an ineffective force fighting with outdated strategy and tactics in two-dimensional force on force, mass driven struggle resulting in heavy losses. I'll explain what is two-dimensional. It's the traditional battlefield tactics where ground troops maneuver using tanks and artillery without involving significant air. We have spoken about how the outdated tactics resulted in losses. Let's look at the gains and losses of China in strategic perspective. One of the major gains was that China exposed Moscow's inability or unwillingness to back Vietnam. China was quick to withdraw before the Soviet Union could intervene into the war. Barring sending security advisors and few weapons, those two arrived after the Chinese had already withdrawn. China did bleed Vietnam and contained Hanoi's expansion in Southeast Asia. One of the biggest gains of China in the strategic arena was its improved relationship with West, particularly the USA. The war demonstrated China's strategic value to the world. Immediately after the war, the West started providing money and equipment to deter Soviets. This resulted in modernization of PLA and the economic boom that has taken place in China, and it is now a near superpower. Talking about the losses, use of military force against Vietnam raised suspicions in Indonesia and Malaysia, who have always been wary of China's influence in the region. China was portrayed as an expansionist power by the region. Did China achieve its war objectives? As far as achievements are concerned, the Vietnamese military and civilian installations in the border area had been completely destroyed. This resulted in a big blow to Vietnamese economy. PLA did inflict significant casualties on few Vietnamese regular units. There is no doubt that troops gained valuable combat experience and the commanders gained lessons on command and control. The invasion did demonstrate to foreign powers that China meant what it said. As far as failures are concerned, as we have covered in the previous slide, it intensified regional tensions, strengthened Soviet Vietnam alliance further, disturbed East Asia and Southeast Asian countries as well as the USA. At the operations and tactical level, China exhibited the initiative and controlled the speed and tempo of the operation through the entire operation. The biggest lesson the PLA learned was that war fighting in hilly and jungle terrain is different from civil war. It was necessary to devise mid battle adjustments, which favored small unit tactics. As far as failures are concerned, Vietnam's combat seasoned force, equipped with modern Soviet weapons, outperformed the inexperienced PLA. This showed in ratio of casualties, both dead and injured. In conclusion, the 1979 war with Vietnam, from Chinese perspective, was a deliberated, orchestrated military response to Vietnamese policy towards China. And Vietnam's effort towards expansion in Southeast were stalled by this action. The PLA exhibited its preference for mobile operations with deep attack penetrations and flanking maneuvers. This was most evident during the Battle of Long Son. The 79 military campaign remained a classic two-dimensional force on force with heavy losses on both sides. There is no doubt that Vietnamese troops performed poorly when fighting large battle, but did extremely well when using guerrilla tactics and sabotage attack. These points can be covered if this question appears as a 10 mark. Coming on to handle question number 3, the geopolitical environment after withdrawal of the PLA. As we had seen, the relationship between China and Vietnam escalated into Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. This was in response to Vietnam's invasion and occupation of Cambodia. After the war also, the hostilities continued, skirmishes and border conflict persisted throughout the 1980s. And neither did Vietnam withdraw from Cambodia. As far as this geopolitical aim of China is concerned, it can be considered as a failure. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia and the establishment of pro-Vietnamese government in Cambodia isolated Vietnam regionally. The ASEAN countries consolidated its position against Vietnam's action in Cambodia, and it led to increase in regional cooperation amongst Asian members. This aspect was exploited by China to form a economic unit with ASEAN and counter Soviets' influence in the region. The Sino-Soviet split further deepened, and this forced Soviet Union to support Vietnam against China in the coming decade. Probably the most important geopolitical fallout of this war was that Deng was able to portray China as a part of camp of the West, particularly the USA, against the Soviet. Let's recall that this was the era of Cold War, where the US and the USSR were fighting with each other. China was an important ally in the camp of the USA against its war with the Soviet Union. This led to normalization of US-China relations. In late 70s and early 80s, there was a significant development in US-China relationship, culminating in the formal establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979. It was in 1979 that the US recognized Communist China, which came into being on 1st of November 1949. What was the implication of US policy? There was a strategic reassessment. Following this war, the US saw the opportunity to counterbalance Soviet influence in Asia by improving ties with China. And the United States also started increasing its support for ASEAN country, thereby negating spread of communism in this region. Japan also decided to support Vietnam and the Asian countries against China. In fact, rise of Asian country is attributed to support of Japan as well as the USA. The legacy of Vietnam War was in terms of human and economic impact. Vietnam was devastated with significant human and economic losses. Rebuilding and recovery became the central focus for the Vietnamese government. Vietnamese could not exert beyond their own country after this war. In summary, the post withdrawal saw significant realignments and strategic shifts in China. China and Vietnam's relationship remained tense, influenced by broader Cold War dynamics and regional responses. China's opening to the West and its pragmatic foreign policy under Deng Xiaoping, along with increased US involvement in ASEAN, reshaped the geopolitical landscape in Southeast Asia. With this, I come to an end of today's episode. I will request you to please like, share, and subscribe. Do comment and put in questions in the comment section. We will try and answer them soon. Thank you and Jai Hind.